Hi, I'm Neil Kelleher. In this video I want to talk about stability, bracing, creating stiffness or resisting change. And one of the reasons that it's a good idea to be able to create stability anywhere within our body, not just the core, is so that we can create a desired change, so that we can move our body or control it or resist movement in the way that we want. So with movement, the basic engines of movement in our body are our muscles, and muscles in general connect one point to another point. They'll cross one, so they'll connect one point to another point. They'll cross one joint or multiple joints. But in order for muscles to work effectively, a basic idea that I work with is that a muscle needs a fixed endpoint. So for example, if you're a mountaineer climbing a mountain and you have a safety rope, in general you like to have one end of the rope secure, tied to a fixed endpoint, so that should you fall, you can grab the rope and prevent falling. And a similar idea can apply with muscles. In order for muscles to work effectively, it helps if the brain understands which end of the muscle is the reference point. So if, for example, you're trying to control the sartorius, which is a muscle that attaches from the top of the shin to the asics, so it crosses the knee and it crosses the hip. If you want to use the sartorius effectively, it helps if the brain understands, okay, is the shin rotated against internal rotation, or is the hip anchored against flexion? If it has one of those, or maybe it doesn't say I'm using those words for you, but the brain won't say that. It'll say, okay, which end is a fixed end? So which end am I contracting towards, or which end am I resisting, lengthening via the sartorius? When we flex a bicep, is this end of the bicep the part that attaches to the coracoid process and over to the top of the scapula? Is that end fixed, or is the end that attaches here, is that end fixed? When the brain, so in general we assume anatomists tend to assume that it's the part of the muscle that attaches closest to the central core that is the fixed end, hence the term origin and insertion. And so in general we can say, okay, probably the brain assumes that this end is fixed, so then it can contract and move this end. But a more flexible idea, and I'd suggest a more general one is actually a bit more useful, is the idea of picking a reference point for any muscle. So with the sartorius, say you're standing, it's probably fairly obvious that you'll want to stabilize the shin against rotation. Then you can use the sartorius to help control the hip bone relative to the shin and relative to the femur. So in general, and probably this needs a bit more explanation, but in general, one way to better control your muscles is to give your muscles a fixed endpoint or have a reference. And it doesn't mean that the part can't move, it just means that you need one end of that muscle to be fixed so that you can use the other end to control whatever is on the other end. What that means is when you anchor one end of the muscle, you are creating stability, or you're creating a point that is more stable than the other point. And as a result, you can use the muscle with one end anchored, you can use the muscle to create a change or to resist change. So say if someone was pushing on me, I could use my muscles in such a way, with anchoring my muscles, I can use my muscles in such a way to resist the push. If I relax totally, I can go with the push. Or I can use my muscles to push in such a way that I can push back. So I'm either trying to create a change, resist it, or I'm just going with it. So let's look at something like core stability. So there's the idea that we should always work with a stiffened core or a braced core or a stable core. And using the sort of language terminology I was just talking about, I'd suggest a good idea when working with core control is to pick a fixed endpoint. Are you working from fixed hip bones or relatively stable hip bones? are you working from a relatively stable rib cage? If you have a stable rib cage, you can use your abdominals and your spine erectors to help control the hip bones. If your hip bones are stable, you can use your abs to help control the rib cage and the upper body. Now, going on from there, an important idea is, so talk about how you, so an important idea is, when creating stability, one way that you can create stability across joints is to use muscles against each other. You can use, say for example, the obliques and rectus rectus abdominis against the spinal erectors. So you have spinal erectors that attach from the sacrum to the thoracic vertebrae and the back of the ribs. You have spinal erectors that attach from the top of the hip bone to the back of the ribs. So those spinal erectors in particular can be used to pull down on the back of the rib cage. The obliques rectus abdominis can be used to pull on the front of the rib cage. So using those muscles against each other, say assuming you have a anchored hip bone and sacrum, say you're creating a downward pull on the back of the hip bones, you can use the spinal erectors first. You can then use the obliques and rectus abdominis to resist and thus create stability. An important idea here is that you don't need to have the spine in a neutral position in order to stabilize it, in order to brace it. Because the spine is made up of however many vertebrae, you can twist it, you can bend it sideways, forwards, you can make all sorts of shapes with the spine, these shapes can be driven by muscle activation. But in addition, if you're twisting the spine, if you twist slowly, smoothly, you're using muscles against each other. You're using one set of muscles to drive the twist, and another set of muscles is resisting, giving those muscles something to work against. But perhaps a simpler definition, a simpler idea is in any position of the spine, in any disposition of the spine, you can use, say for example, your spinal erectors against your abs to stabilize the spine in this position. Bending to the side, you can use side muscles, one side against another, to stabilize the spine. Bending forward. Although the spinal erectors are lengthened, they can still potentially activate. You can thus use your abs against your spinal erectors to stabilize your spine in this position. Not always recommended. You may have to fine-tune the way you do that. You may have to do something like pulling your transverse abdominis when bending forwards, so that you can bend the spine forward actively and stabilize in this position without it hurting your lower back. But it is something that is possible. Likewise, when bending the spine backwards, you can use your spinal erectors, you can use your abs to resist. You can thus stabilize the spine in a variety of positions. But the further you bend to one side, the further you twist, the more muscles are lengthened, the harder it can become to stabilize. So in an end range position like forward bending, your spinal erectors are going to be working a little bit more harder. They're going to be possibly at the end of their range of motion. So when working towards stabilizing in end range positions, you have to be a bit more careful, but it is possible to create stability with the spine in different positions, not just with the spine neutral. So in the same way for any of the other joints, so for example the foot and the ankle, you could consider that a collection of joints much like the spine. You can stiffen the foot, you use muscles against each other across the foot and ankle, and with the foot in different positions so that you can stabilize the foot, whether it's pointed like this, whether the arch is collapsed like this, you can stabilize the foot, whether the arch is highly lifted like so, you can stabilize the foot. Likewise with the knee, so the knee can bend and straighten. It can also rotate to a certain extent for any of those positions. So even with the knee straight, you can have the muscles relax so the knee's sort of flaccid with the knee straight, but you can use the flexors and the extenders of the knee against each other. You can use the external and internal rotators of the knee against each other to make the knee stiff, whether it is straight, whether it is slightly bent, whether it is rotated inwards or rotated outwards. You can stabilize the knee in any of those positions by using the muscles that cross the knee, that rotate the knee or bend it. You can use those muscles, opposing muscles against each other to stabilize the knee in the same way you can stabilize the hip. So standing, we tend to stand with relaxed hips because we're on relatively relaxed hips because we're on both feet, so we don't need it to control so much. But standing on one leg, it's a bit easier to feel muscles activate. And so standing one leg, you can practice stabilizing the hip, using muscles against each other, whether they're rotators or whether they're bending forward or backward muscles, whether they're tilting in or out, so adductor, abductor, flexors, extensors, whichever muscles, whichever opposing pairs of muscles you're using, you can use muscles against each other to stabilize the hip in any direction. If you use more or less all of those muscles, you can make the hip stable against any sort of external change. And what that can then do, I talked earlier about anchoring the abs, so with the hip bone stable relative to the femur, relative to the shin, you then have an anchor for your abs to be able to work on the spine, not just to move it, but also to stiffen it in any position that you like. So I'd suggest an important idea for bracing, for creating stability. First of all, figure out what your starting point is. What is the foundation? What is the anchor? It can be working from the ground up, in which case maybe it's from the foot up. If you're on your hands, it can be from the foot up, from the hand up to the shoulder. It could also be from the core outwards, but if you're working from the core outwards, I'd suggest have a starting point, have a reference. Are you starting with the rib cage as your foundation? Are you starting with your hips? Could be something as simple as lengthening the neck with the head pulling away from the shoulders and your neck long. That can be a way of anchoring your rib cage, so that then your rib cage can help anchor your abs and your spine erectors, and then from there you can use the legs with a bit more freedom. You can express yourself via your legs. So I've gone over a lot of basic ideas or general ideas. I've gone over a lot of ideas in this video, but at the core of all of these ideas is the idea of having a reference, a fixed reference, something that you're using as an endpoint. So for example, if the focus is on the core, are you stabilizing your hip bones first, so that then you can use your abs to either stabilize the midsection or control it or move it? Are you stabilizing the rib cage first, in which case maybe lengthen your neck first so that your neck muscles help to pull up the ribs. You then have more control of your rib cage. You can use your rib cage as a foundation for the abs. So pick a reference point for controlling your muscles. So rather than just bracing the core, what I'd suggest can be a bit more helpful. If you're standing on both legs, you could work from the ground up. You could work from the top, the center outwards, but have an idea of which one you're using. Are you stabilizing are you using your hips as an anchor for your abs? Are you using your rib cage? Likewise, when working with something like the knees, are you stabilizing the feet first and then working your way up to the hip, or are you stabilizing your hip first and then working your way down to the foot? That can be helpful for the knees. In the same way with the elbows and the shoulders. With the shoulders, you have a bit more flexibility than the hips. So with the shoulders, you could be stabilizing the rib cage, lengthening the neck first, so that the muscles that work between the rib cage and spine, that work from the spine and rib cage, even the hips and the head, to the shoulder blades, they have a foundation from which to control or stabilize or anchor the shoulder blades. From there, with your shoulder blades anchored, all the muscles which attach from the shoulder blade to the upper arms and from the shoulder blade to the lower arms, those have a stable foundation from which to work on your arms, both on your elbows and your arms. With the shoulders, you could be working from the hand up. So in that case, you could work at maybe feeling control in your hands, then your elbows. Remember, the elbows rotate, so elbow rotation stability is just as important as bending, flexing stability and control as with the knees. From there, you can control the shoulder joints And then from there you can control the scapula, and then from there muscles was attached from the scapula to the ribcage spine, have an anchor from which to work on the ribcage. And that can be helpful in poses where your arms are bearing some or all of your body weight. So one other idea with stability, and this relates to rotation. So as I've said a couple of times, the knees can rotate, they have a slight amount of rotation, the elbows can rotate. So actually it's the forearms rotating relative to the upper arm, so shins in general rotating relative to the femur. And one way that you can think of this with the knees in particular, with the knees able to rotate, the muscles that control rotation can be used to help transmit torque from the foot up to the hip and from the hip down to the foot. So the rotational ability of the knees is slight, but it enables forces, turning forces, to be transmitted from the foot to the hip and the hip to the foot. But an important idea when creating stability, when bracing, is if you are, say, bracing the hip for rotate, an important idea can be when bracing the foot, you could brace against flexion extension, you could brace against rotation, but if you're bracing against rotation, so if you stabilize your foot against rotation, that can make it easier to stabilize your knee against rotation, that can make it easier to stabilize your hip against rotation. So as a final note, what I'd suggest is be aware of what you're stabilizing for. So it isn't just, say, stabilizing the hip relative to isn't just about stabilizing the hip bone, but what are you stabilizing it against? What sort of forces is it turning forces that you're stabilizing against, or is it bending forces? Or are you trying to stabilize against everything, in which case you need to be aware of all of these possibilities so that you can stabilize for everything. Anyway, I think that's it for this one. So the basic focus of this was on how to create stability, but understanding that since muscles work against muscles to create stability, or they can work against an external force to create stability. The first point is to understand that muscles need a fixed endpoint, and from there you can use muscles against each other to create stability, to resist change. But another important idea is that it helps when creating stability to understand the type of change you're trying to resist or control, so that you can create stability relative to that change that you're trying to create or control. And another point is that for any of the joints of the body or any of the parts of the body, you can stabilize them in a variety of positions. You can stabilize the knees when they're straight, you can stabilize the elbows when they're straight, you can stabilize the spine when it's straight, you can stabilize it when it's bent forward, backwards, twisted to the side. In any conceivable position, provided you have muscle control, you can create stability, you can brace the different parts of your body. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope it was helpful. Namaste.